You're watching or listening to Strangers in Space, and for the next 20 minutes or so, we're going to be doing a little more Doctor Who what ifery, so you don't have to. Hi, I'm JR.
Hi, I'm Matt.
Hi, I'm Dylan.
And I'm John.
So I'm going to go back in time a little bit now. I mean, we're clearly going back in time because we're going back to the 1980s to rewrite the history of Doctor Who. But I'm going to go back a little bit in our own history because this was a subject that came up on one of the earlier sort of what if things. And I'd meant to dig into this a bit more. And then we got sidetracked into all sorts of things involving like Eric Saywood and the 1990s and stuff like that. So I never got back to this at the time. And David Moss asked a question which was fairly similar to the one that I was going to do anyway. And so finally, we're getting to David Moss's question, and we're getting to the subject that I was going to bring up a while ago. And so it comes back to this. And the way we almost got into it before was that what if JNT hadn't been the producer in the 1980s? But we kind of skirted over that very quickly indeed. We didn't really get into the question. So I want to ask the question, what if, because JNT was the BBC's second choice, George Galaccio, I don't know how you pronounce it, I'm going with Galaccio, he was their first choice. I want to ask the question, what if he hadn't turned it down? So I want to ask the question, so who would his script editor be? Robert Banks-Stewart. So we want to talk maybe a little bit about Robert Banks-Stewart, because Banks-Stewart's career took off just after the 1980s began, rather than just before. So he's a potentiality. So I want to ask what George Galaccio and Robert Banks-Stewart's Doctor Who would have looked like, or whether anybody else would have been maybe the script editor instead. But David Moss asks, and so this is same timeline, different result. He says, how would Doctor Who have been different if Blake 7 was never made? And so the alternative to George Galaccio and Robert Banks-Stewart is potentially David Maloney and Chris Boucher, right? So these are the sort of twin timelines I want to get into. What does George Galaccio's Doctor Who look like with Robert Banks-Stewart as script editor? And what does David Maloney's Doctor Who look like with Chris Boucher as script editor? As you can see, these are things we've touched on a little bit before, but we've never made them the sort of center of our discussion. And so that's kind of what I want to do here. Do you want to start with Galaccio and Robert Banks-Stewart, or do you want to go the more familiar route, David Maloney and Chris Boucher? Maybe we go the more familiar route, David Maloney and Chris Boucher.
I think there's a question with both of them.
Yeah.
And the question is, would they produce Doctor Who either as they had made Doctor Who before, or as they would have made other things in the 1980s? So would Doctor Who, because I've just Wikipedia'd Galaccio just to check what he'd done. He's sort of Bergerac, Miss Marple, so sumptuous drama. Would Doctor Who have taken that form? No, it wouldn't, because Doctor Who would still get the same budget. JNT
having said that, JNT tries, doesn't he?
Well, JNT is very good at stretching the money out and wringing the budget for putting it as much on screen as possible. So maybe Galaccio isn't that sort of producer because he gets Miss Marple, which I assume the BBC spent a fair whack on.
Yeah.
Because Joan Hickson's cocaine habit needed that fueling.
I actually wonder whether with both of these potential timelines, Doctor Who stays much the same as it was in the 70s or takes safer routes into the 80s. And perhaps the sort of quintessential 80s-ness of JNT's Doctor Who is something that kept it a lot more alive than people think. But both of these versions get cancelled around 82, 83, probably maybe with Tom Baker still in the role, maybe with a completely different actor in the role, but it just runs its course as the kids who are into it grow out of it, and they're making a more outdated version of television than perhaps the kids of the 80s want to see.
But there's And
I guess that raises the question of how much of the 80s-ness is John Nathan Turner and how much is simply the changing environment at the BBC, the changing technology with, I want to say Qantas, but it's not Qantas, Quantel.
Yeah.
The changing budgets. So how much of this was forced? I'm not sure JNT went in saying, right, let's make 1980s Doctor Who.
Oh no, he absolutely did. He said,
he did,
I want to bring
totally.
the show very much into the 80s.
So
That's
he's trying
the
to
point
make
of the Ledger Hive.
a modern television show, and he was changing the look of the show. But the actual, I want to know, so for me, the question is, how much of that was required by the technology and the budget, and how much it was actively like pushed by JNT?
Oh, I think it's 50-50 because I think so. JNT wants to make Doctor Who resemble the 1980s, but at the same time, it is the 1980s, so that's going to have an effect whether JNT wants it to or not.
Yeah.
But my counter to Dylan's point is, see, I don't think Doctor Who in the 1970s looks like the 1970s. Other than, you know, when they're on modern day Earth, people are wearing flares or whatever. You can't get away from that. But I think Doctor Who in the 1970s is trying to be like Hammer were like in the 1960s. So Doctor Who's already behind the times. And I also think that sort of parallel counter is, I think kids watching, and we're talking sort of 8 to 12-year-olds rather than 11 to 14-year-olds or whatever. We're talking slightly younger kids, probably. They're not concerned with their telly, especially science fiction telly, resembling what's going on around. So I don't know. I think Doctor Who survives not looking like the 1980s and the 1980s because part of Doctor Who's character is to be the eccentric thing that doesn't look like what's around it. And so although obviously it does, I think going back to what Matt said, if you take the JNT part out, you still get plenty of 1980s in there just because it's the 1980s and it's going to bleed in whatever happens. But I think the problem with what JNT does is he wants to make it like the 1980s, so it becomes this sort of uber 1980s thing that's just horribly glossily 1980s rather than sort of acceptably partially 1980s.
It's at the camp end of 1980s, and I think you certainly would lose a lot of the camp of what we had with
both
JNT.
of those producers. Yeah,
absolutely. They're both more seriously minded, and they're very they're all very kind of traditionally British. Apart from maybe Boucher, traditional BBC guys. I would say 3 of them have been on staff there, so I think it would have been certainly a more conventional one. My instinct would be to say that it would be Hinchcliffe influenced. And I don't think it looked like 1980s for the same reason Hinchcliffe doesn't look like 1980s, because they don't do many contemporary stories.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't the thing that George Galaccio does almost immediately the start of the 1980s the Omega Factor?
Yeah.
So
that doesn't look like 1970s TV. That's kind of VT sort of video cameras.
It's
very
a mix.
urban.
Yeah.
It's very sort of, it's more, in a way, it's more 80s than Doctor Who was in Davison's first season.
I don't think it was.
It feels more like 70s television to me. In fact, if you'd asked me, I would have said that the Omega Factor was 1977, something like that.
It's 79, so it's not far off. But I'm thinking of the exterior shots in the Omega Factor. They aren't done on film; they're done on VT.
Are they?
Yeah.
See, I've not watched it for ages.
But I think VT is one of the things that does age things these days.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, that's my point. But I think one of the things, and this is off a tangent a little bit, but one of the things for me that makes 70s Doctor Who feels 70s is really nice filmed location shooting. Mask of Mandragora, Pyramids of Mars. And in a way that kind of stretches into JNT. JNT carries on, does it with Visitation and even into Colin Baker. You still get quite nice filmed location shoots. But there is something about, taking a VT camera on location that makes it feel a bit more up to date. With the Omega Factor is BBC Scotland, so it might be because it's sort of a regional thing that it's sort of done like that for a purpose. But you could either go that way, but he's also known in 1985 onwards for Miss Marple, which is the complete reverse of the Omega Factor. There's the Omega Factor, which is all VT and sort of seriousness, and Miss Marple, which is an uber traditional filmed BBC classic series, basically.
And Bergerac, of course, and that's where it works with Robert Banks Stewart. They've worked together before, I think.
I think, yeah, Boucher and Banks, they both make their bones on on kind of procedural shows. They both like their crime. So I think
They
you'd have that
do
kind of
after
thing.
this
It would be
point, don't
heavily
they?
structured, yeah.
Well, that's what I mean. That's why I'm asking, because I think this is a really interesting sort of juncture for all of them. This is before any of those, either of those two script editors had sort of made their successors, as it were. And this is also before George Galaccio makes all the things that he's best known for too. So of the four names that I've put in front of you, David Maloney is the only one with a lot of career behind him rather than in front of him. And certainly Bank Stewart hasn't done Bergerac yet. Chris Boucher hasn't done Star Cops yet. And he hasn't done all his script editing stuff on all these things too. And of course, in this scenario, he doesn't do Blake 7 either. So the question isn't, do they make Doctor Who in the style of other things that we know they made? But the question is, if they didn't get to make those things because they were making Doctor Who, is the thing that's within them that made them make those things going to be in Doctor Who? Or are they going to find something else instead and become a different type of writer to a certain degree, insofar as you can?
Which is kind of my point, is does Doctor Who as a series have like a specific form that it automatically snaps to at various times? How much influence does a producer have in actually shaping the feel of it, or the sort of the temporality of it?
That's what comes in, because Hinchcliffe gets booted because he has too much of a say in that.
Yeah,
because he takes it too far, and then Graham Williams instructs. So I think to a certain degree, those last three producers are on a leash. So you need to convince the BBC execs of what your vision for the show is, to make sure you're not putting out, a man being dragged on Saturday evening as your cliffhanger.
And they do that with JNT by bringing in Barry Letts to kind of sit behind him. So the interesting thing.
Well, just the other thing about JNT is the reason they bring him in is because he's untried as a producer, so he's not going to step out of line. Whereas if you'd put in somebody like David Maloney, who's got like 10, 15 years of sort of producing and directing behind him, David Maloney is much more likely to have a stronger head about what he wants. David Maloney, I don't think he would have been like Hinchcliffe, but David Maloney probably would have wanted to influence Doctor Who to a similar degree as Hinchcliffe had. So Maloney would probably have had fairly strong ideas about the look and feel and themes of it, I would have thought.
But as we've seen, JNT did make big changes.
Yeah, he does. Yeah.
So I think the interesting question is, JNT's a sort of first-time producer. How much of that isn't? So I don't see JNT as being a failure. I see JNT as being a success until he fails at the end.
Yeah.
But initially, that's a reasonable success. He kind of brings Doctor Who back onto an even keel, pretty much in those two seasons. He kind of consolidates it, and then he gives it a fillip in the first Peter Davison series. And how much of that is due to him being? I mean, he's kind of a BBC wonder kid. So you wouldn't get that with David Maloney. Steadying the ship isn't necessarily what was being looked for at this point, but giving it a kind of a boot in the arse, maybe it was.
Maybe, I wonder if he'd shifted, because the show in the early 80s shifts to a very different broadcast format. It goes to 2 episodes per week in midweek.
Yeah.
Would, say, David Maloney have resisted that? Would the show have stayed Saturday evening tea time stuff? Would that tone have been there?
Would he have had the power to resist that?
Yeah, I mean, if he's got Boucher, I think it would have a midweek slot would have suited them down to the ground, because Boucher's going to be a bit more cynical, a little more nihilistic. So it's going to be Eric Sable with better stories and better dialogue, I think, to a certain degree.
Well, because whoever was going to come in was going to be a reaction to the Graham Williams era, which was perceived as being too silly. So there's only really 2 directions you can go: the sort of JNT direction, or backwards to the sort of Hinchcliffe and Holmes direction, I think.
Or even Letts and Dixon. As well.
When was Blake 7 broadcast? Was that on Saturday?
77 to 81.
No, what day?
It was a weekly show. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, January 78, isn't it? The first
Yeah, I
Yes,
did mean
it's
when
just
in the
after
week was it
new
shown?
Star Wars comes out. Yeah.
Yeah, so it goes those 4 years. So yeah, these guys would have been free sooner, but then actually JNT takes over in 79, doesn't he? Because his first series doesn't come out till second half of 80, but he must have been installed by the end of 79 in order to be taken over at that point. So yeah, I mean the timing's not quite right, but it's close enough.
You know,
Robert,
if Maloney took over, you wouldn't get Day of the Triffids.
yeah, that's true. We'd miss that.
I mean,
But then again, that's the other question: is if any of these people had taken over, they wouldn't have stayed as long as JNT, right? I mean, potentially we could have had Maloney and Boucher, and then Galaccio and Banks Stewart a couple of years after that. Although clearly in that scenario, Banks Stewart's starting to have his success now, so wouldn't have come on board as a script editor. But you know what I mean?
He might have done if the series had been moving towards his style rather than away. If there was something in it that could be shaped, and if the BBC still had confidence in it. So that's the other question. We know the BBC started losing confidence in it around the time of Warriors of the Deep, which isn't that 3 years into JNT?
Longer, isn't it? 4, I
Well,
think.
it's the start of the 4th year, yeah. It's the start of the 4th season, so yeah.
So,
But I think the interesting thing for me is because this is the era where fandom loves its continuity. JNT plugs into that and gives us loads and loads of stuff from the past. I don't think any of these guys would be anywhere near as interested in the past, and I think that might have really influenced the show going forward on that. You wouldn't see.
In a bad way or a good way? Because I've heard both sides of the argument that ignoring the past is actually a good way of cementing the series for the future.
There's a balance to be struck, I think.
I think it's about how you do it. And so as a counter to what John's just said, it might not be that they ignore the past, but it might be that they're more careful and more choosy about how they use the past. So just as when Robert Holmes brings back the Master, just as when Barry Letts, actually, as it turns out, decides that the way to do the Daleks is to give them a creator. If you'd had, say, Robert Banks Stewart or Chris Boucher come in, quite easily they could have gone back and said, right, do you know what Doctor Who's always done? These things called the Cybermen, but they've never really got a handle on what it is about the Cybermen that ought to make them scary, what it is about the Cybermen that motivates them. Do you know, I was listening to Flight Through Entirety this morning, and they were talking about because I'm a couple of weeks behind on podcasts, so I was listening to the Under the Lake and Before the Flood episodes. No, other way around, isn't it? So they were talking about the Fisher King and about the fact that that's a Doctor Who villain stroke monster that's brought in, isn't really given anything to do, isn't really directed in an interesting way. And all I could think when listening is, yeah, I remember watching it and thinking this is a character that doesn't exist off the screen. What Robert Holmes and Philip Hinchcliffe and Barry Letts and Terence Dicks were all interested in were writing stories about characters that did exist off the screen, that you could imagine having lives and existences outside of the fiction. And I think that's something that gets lost when JNT comes in, because he's not a storyteller, he's a showman.
Yeah.
And so I don't think that's necessarily a failing in and of itself. But the point with being a showman rather than a storyteller is you're not as interested in the characters' internal lives. I think Chris Boucher, Robert Banks Stewart give us a version of Doctor Who that's more like it had been in the sort of early and mid 1970s, where you can imagine these characters like Brain and Morbius. You look at name's gone out of my head. Exactly. That's a character that you 100% believe existed before the story started, and apart from the fact that he's dead by the end of it, you could imagine he would have existed after the story had finished too. You can't say that about a lot of the villains during the sort of 1980s, unfortunately. And for me, Robert Banks Stewart is absolutely a writer who does that. So I don't know. I think for me, it would have been a Doctor Who that perhaps would have been slightly duller, certainly visually, than Doctor Who was in the 1980s, but probably would have been more fulfilling, especially sort of for fans because repeated viewings and stuff being something that we habitually do, I think we'd have got more out of it, maybe.
I don't think it's controversial to say that Chris Boucher and Robert Banks Stewart are better writers than maybe Eric Sayward.
Hush your mouth.
But I also,
Possibly Christopher H. Bidmead as well, who was an interesting, I thought was an interesting writer, but not necessarily, suited for drama.
I think
it wasn't really interested. Sorry, just to add to Matt's point, I don't think Chris Bidmead was really all that interested in characters.
No,
I think
those ideas.
Yeah.
Ideas.
Sorry, Dylan, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think sort of going back to what you were saying about the obsession with continuity and stuff, it's also that relationship with the fans that I don't think, Hinchcliffe certainly, or Williams, they had relationships with the fans, but it wasn't as sort of, JNT was so driven by them, and, having Ian Levine as an unofficial continuity advisor and things. I think a more seasoned and older producer wouldn't have made those mistakes.
Do you know what it is? JNT and the fans is like if you had Russell T Davies or Stephen Moffat and they took all their instruction from Twitter and ignored because Twitter, you do not get a balanced sense of how everybody feels. You just get the loudest voices, and JNT and the fans, it's exactly like that. It's the loudest voices thing, isn't it?
Or it's a ridiculous situation where Russell T Davies spends most of his time emailing a journalist whilst he's writing, gets ideas from them, and basically uses that to distract him from actually finishing episodes. So he's constantly in a state of rush.
Are you saying Benjamin Cook is the sort of 2000s version of Ian Levine?
Well, he absolutely is. But I think there's a distraction with JNT. He was a salesman, and he seemed sometimes more interested in selling the series and having nice holidays whilst he did it than being there and actually producing the series. And I don't think David Maloney or Robert Banks Stewart, or I think these are all. I think there's a different level of different meaning to professionalism. I think there's this kind of entrenched BBC will make this program and the BBC will sell it, and then there's JNT who just.
Well, JNT's interested in being a star. He may not be an actor, but he's interested. Like he's out there on the front line doing publicity for the show and at conventions and stuff, which again a more traditional BBC producer wouldn't. I'm not saying that's wrong. Perhaps it was wrong for the time, because we all know that Russ T Davies is a very front-facing producer and showrunner.
Yeah, in many ways it's ahead of its time.
Yeah,
because I think the Russell T Davies, Stephen Moffat approach, I think possibly serves the series better than the shy Chris Chibnall approach.
Yeah,
and I respect the shy Chris Chibnall approach, because he's writing the series and living his own life and not really popping up much on Doctor Who magazine or on television.
Busy getting a hair transplant.
But at the same time, as a way of branding the series based on the showrunner, then JNT seemed to want to be a showrunner, but didn't have, unfortunately, the creative abilities that RTD and Moffat have.
Having said that,
you get to do that in Time the Rani.
Well, Doctor Who is apart from the rest of the television in that respect, because no other series has producers and writers who go and do the publicity tours in the way that Doctor Who does, do they? Can you think of any other producer or writer who's even
Jed Mercurio, kind of big names get? Your Paul Abbott's and Jed Mercurio's would.
But I have no idea what Jed Mercurio looks like, and I've certainly never seen Paul Abbott popping up on BBC Breakfast and The One Show and all sorts of other things.
You see it more in America, I think.
Yes,
basically. So the sort of the Marvel-y kind of Comic-Con stuff in America. But then Doctor Who is particular in that you don't sell Line of Duty by releasing the episode at Comic-Con, because it's not a kind of telefantasy series. You're not going to, sell Casualty like that either. Is Casualty still going on?
Yes.
Yes, Casualty goes.
Really? How?
He's the one that stopped.
I don't know.
Someone's
just forgot to cancel it.
Hasn't everybody in Bristol fallen on a spike?
They film it in Wales now. They've come to maim us.
Oh, really? Okay.
I don't know if you've ever been in, what's it called, Bristol Royal Infirmary, but I've got to tell you, the number of people walking through the doors has never stopped in the last 20 years. So there's no reason why a program about that kind of thing should ever stop.
That's true, but they've all got chlamydia. They haven't got something interesting. They haven't.
You've been
like,
spending too much time on cancer.
intricate-
Matt is
an
not going
intricate
to Bristol
999
anytime
accident.
Matt, I wouldn't go to Bristol anytime soon.
Well,
You might catch something.
Why do you think I moved away from the West Country? I'd done my work.
On that note, I don't know. Do you want to carry on with the slightly smaller question?
Should we score it?
The full Barbara experience, it's a 6, you know.
Okay, I'll tell you what. Actually, I've got a question in front of me that was written by somebody who is on this Skype call now. And this was do you remember I put the call out a few months ago? Had anybody listening to this or watching this? We'll take questions. If you've got things where you think, oh, what would have happened if? Write in, we're all over social media or whatever, or find one of us in particular and get the question to us. We have had a bunch of questions and we will get to them. But this one actually came from Matt. And this was one of those story specific questions, really.
God,
So
This is going to be twisted.
I don't think it's particularly twisted. Actually, it's not an entirely unobvious question, really. But I guess it's one that's definitely worth talking about. And so let's do it now, because it's kind of I think it's probably a 5-minute question. But this was a story specific one, like when I did the Inferno one, where I said, what if Inferno had gone like this instead of like that? And what Matt says is, what if the Dominators wasn't so shit it killed itself an episode early? Would we then get the third Yeti story? Would the Mind Robber be rubbish without its first episode? In other words, the Mind Robber would basically just have started in the land of fiction and you'd have entirely missed that first episode. The Dominators would have crawled on for 25 extra minutes, but Haseman and Lincoln would have been happy enough and presumably would have done another Yeti story in that final season. But more importantly still, they'd still be writing Doctor Who into the 1970s, and we'd never have had that book that Henry Lincoln wrote about
the Holy Blood and Holy Grail. I think we would have got.
So we would never have
Doctor
got Dan Brown either.
We would have got Doctor Who meets the Da Vinci Code.
Do you know what I do think it means? We do get the third Yeti story. I think it also means that Anne Travers appears in The Invasion, and that potentially Liz Shaw never exists, and it's Anne Travers that appears in Spearhead from Space.
And we wouldn't get the War Games as well, because basically the War Games basically a filler for 10 weeks based on ideas that have been dropped.
Or the War Games is 4 episodes.
4 parts, yeah.
Or I'm not entirely sure, because I have a feeling that the third Yeti story was earlier in the season, and that's the one that got replaced.
No, it's the one Jamie leaves in, isn't it?
Yeah.
Is it? Fair enough. But is he not due to leave during the, because if you remember, season 6 is split into two with a mid-season break, isn't it? Was Jamie not due to leave at the start of that 6?
No, I thought he was due to leave right at the end, but I will stand to be corrected on that.
I see. I'd always took it that the third Yeti story was in the position where the invasion is.
No, I think it's part of the War Games, but these things are in such flux. It could have been in both spots at some point.
It's absolute chaos in that production office at the time, so you can't tell. More importantly, we'd have a rematch in TV comic of the Quarks and the Giant Wasps, which I would be all for.
But going back to Matt's question, how does the Mind Robber look without that first episode? Because as much as we all love the Mind Robber, it is that really distinctive first episode that kind of draws us in, isn't it? And the rest of it's fun. But
yeah, it's fun. I think it's possibly not quite at the classic status, but then at the same time, as one of the few Troughton stories that probably would have existed for many years, I think it probably does keep its same status, and certainly it's one that gets repeated again.
Well, I tell you, this is the real answer to the question, isn't it? Because Five Faces of Doctor Who, the only four-part Troughton they had was the Crotons, which they didn't really want to show, but had no choice over. A four-part Mind Robber would have existed. That would have fit that slot perfectly.
Yeah, but then the Peter Ling estate would have popped up and demanded.
He was still alive at the time.
Demanded copyright over Gulliver. Gulliver is my character.
No, Dean Swift would have rolled over from his grave, taken him back.
Slight follow-up then. So the third Yeti story, instead of going forwards in time, goes even further back in time, doesn't it? Isn't it set way back in history, the third Yeti story? Or am I misremembering?
Because it's to do with Jamie's family, isn't it? Or something like that.
I think. So
yeah, he becomes the Laird, doesn't he? I think at the end of it. It's called the Laird of something.
The Laird of McCrimmon.
Yeah.
So actually, that's a story that becomes a prequel to the other two rather than a sequel. Do we think the Doctor Who production teams of the 1960s would have had the nous to actually do it as a prequel, or would they have done it as a sequel that's somehow gone back in time?
I think it's still a sequel that goes. I think at this stage, I think they were basically bringing back monsters, regardless of whether it's 1930s Tibet or 1960s underground. To then put them into 18th century Scotland wouldn't be that much of a stretch. You just wouldn't have the link of Travers and Unit.
And I think you probably get a fourth and fifth.
It probably depends on what time you'd you've dropped into the BBC bar to find the producers.
It would have been a nonsense. It would have been.
I think you probably get a fourth and fifth Yeti story as well in the Pertwee era. I think that they become a monster that keep coming back. I know that there's that famous Pertwee sort of promo picture with the Yeti, and I know they were just pulling things out of storage, but I do see a world where we get them.
I mean, they were in storage, which must have been very attractive to. I'm surprised that gel guards weren't just spray painted Yeti.
What we absolutely 100% don't get then is Inferno and the Mind of Evil, because Don Horton never gets a contract if Haseman and Lincoln are still writing a story a year. So you lose Inferno and you lose the Mind of Evil.
Or you lose the Bristol Boys, right?
Well, the Bristol Boys turn up afterwards, don't they? It's Don Horton who's the writer in the first two seasons, who's the newsboy on the block for the first two.
True. Yeah.
It depends, because it's Uncle Terry's process here, and he famously didn't write off a single script. So there's fewer.
But Don
spaces.
Horton never gets asked. If Haseman and Lincoln are there, Don Horton never gets asked in the first place.
Terence Dix did do development work with the writers, and maybe gets a development work. You'll lose it. You're looking at maybe losing the odd story, but would you lose both Don Horton stories? Would you lose one?
Yeah,
Absolutely,
you would.
I don't think you lose both. I think Terence liked to work with. Well, he likes the familiar writers, but he was also developing new writers behind as well, just in case. So I think Don Horton would have been around.
No, I don't think so. I don't think
it's like the Jimmy Savile conversation all over again.
Oh,
well, kind of the point is, if it's not Don Horton who goes, it's Malcolm Hulke
or David Whittaker.
Yeah, that's not happening, is it, Malcolm?
Well, David Whittaker's gone anyway. That's written by Malcolm Hulke and Terence Dix as it is, isn't it?
But then maybe Malcolm Hulke isn't so prominent because basically the War Games doesn't exist anymore as it is. Maybe we don't get the 7-part stories in season 7 because they've had a more standard kind of, 6-4, 6-4.
Oh, the reason Hulke and Dix work together isn't because of the War Games. It's because they worked together on other things before, and Dix brings in Hulke to help him out with the War Games, doesn't he?
And obviously he used to be Dix's landlord.
Oh, is that? Yes.
Yeah.
So, no, I think absolutely Don Horton is the sacrifice that you make to keep Haseman and Lincoln.
Do they do one every year, though? That's the thing. That's it. Regulars, but...
Well, that's it. At this point, they would have done 4 stories. They would have done 2 a year for each of the last 2 Troughton years. So, yeah, they'd have done at least 1 in each of the Pertwee ones.
I said, there'd still be room, I think, somewhere down the line.
I don't think so, because look, this is the thing of it. Every time Terence Dix get a writer in, he keeps those writers and gives them a script every year. He does it with Robert Holmes. He does it with the Bristol Boys.
There's only one script writer gets a script every year in the Pertwee era.
Who?
Hulk. He's the only one in all 5 seasons.
No, John. Did you mishear what I said?
Yeah, but he does keep his rights around. I know this.
He keeps his writers once he's got them. The Bristol boys, they get a script every year after he's got them. Malcolm Hulk gets a script every year after he's got him. Robert Holmes does, but because of the nature of the production, one of those is recorded at the end of a block and gets put back to the year after. So Robert Holmes technically doesn't have a script every season, but he does have a script every year.
Well, yeah, it's not a point, but yeah.
Don Horton is the only one in that entire era who doesn't get kept on.
Whittaker's not one of his regular. Like he goes to Whittaker as a sort of stalwart of the show. So, but
And
I don't
that
think
doesn't work out, does it?
No, exactly. But I wonder whether he would have gone to Mervyn and Haseman as his tried and tested people for the Whittaker slot.
Oh yeah, I think so. That's a quite reasonable assumption.
That's what I said.
Yeah. But I'm not sure that's true, because the reason he goes to Whittaker is because he thinks he's going to get something safe and easy from him. So he doesn't go to Whittaker. He doesn't say, oh no, I'll throw out Whittaker and use the entirely untested Don Horton instead, does he?
No, but I think if he had tried and tested people already, then that's Mervyn and Haseman.
Maybe. I just think it looks clear as day that
you've got a Southall maybe. Let's leave it at that. Let's put that in the bank.
As good as we're getting.
Right. Anyway, I think that's enough for tonight. But I mean, unless anybody has got any more they want to say about the Mind Robber or the Dominators,
I think the first episode of the Mind Robber is a great transition period, transitions kind of palate cleanser that actually means that the Mind Robber is acceptable. And I think if you just jump into the land of fiction, it's weird and it's a little bit disconcerting. I'm not sure it works quite as well as with that first episode of sort of.
But presumably they just use the HADs or whatever it is they use to get them out of that situation, and they just end up in the land of fiction. And if it wasn't there, you wouldn't miss it.
No,
I'm just trying to work out the opening of the story without it as well. Yeah, just how they land. Where'd you make that entrance?
Well, here's a sort of slightly supplementary question. If you'd have had Yeti stories in the 70s, you would have had them in Unit England, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
So, I mean,
how do you differentiate that from the Web of Fear? That's the thing.
You do it in the countryside.
Well, I don't think you'd necessarily make an attempt to differentiate that from the Web of Fear. It's not like they're trying to make all the Unit stories distinct from each other, is it, John?
Oh yeah, yeah, Planet of Daleks and all that as well. Yeah, fair play.
Yeah.
You would have had the Master controlling Yeti, that sort of thing.
Yeah, that'd be fun.
Yeah,
there you go.
Where you see Autons, see Yeti instead. I think that's the.
I don't know. You'd have both, wouldn't you? I guess.
Hopefully.
Yeah. Anyway, that's an interesting thought. Right, until we do this again, I was JR.
I was Matt.
I was Dylan.
And I was John.
And we will speak again soon.